Welcome. In this session of the IntelliQuest series, you'll become acquainted with a 17th century epic poem that retells the biblical story of Genesis. The poem is called Paradise Lost, and it was written by the English writer John Milton in the year 1667. The poem was originally published in 10 books, but in its second edition, in 1674, 2 of the lengthier books were divided into 2 parts. From then on, the poem was published in 12 books, and still is today. The poem is considered a very difficult one to read, chiefly because of its language. Milton's style is what is called Latinate, which means simply that rather than using common English sentence structure, he used the more elaborate structures taken from Latin. The author had written many other poems in Latin, and actually considered doing the same with Paradise Lost, but finally decided to write it in English instead. This decision was a blessing for our culture, but it does mean, because of his affinity with Latin, that understanding this masterpiece epic requires special effort. In English, sentences usually use the pattern of subject-verb-object. But Milton was fond of inversion. He would begin sentences with the verb, the object of the verb, or even a prepositional phrase. This unusual word order is something he adapted from Virgil and from other great classical epics. Although readers can become accustomed to this style with some practice, initially it's confusing, and they find themselves distracted by trying to locate the subject and verb, and thus determine what is actually happening in any given line. This can make an already massive piece of work very time-consuming. The poem is written in blank verse, or unrhymed lines, of iambic pentameter. It's a verse form which allowed Milton a lot of freedom that was essential for the vast sweep of his subject. Because of this style, he had no need to break the poem into small stanzas, and some of the paragraphs, therefore, are long and complex. In addition, Milton was a very learned man, and his obscure references are a challenge to modern readers, educated or not. He alludes to other works of literature and ideas that were probably more familiar to the 17th century reader, but which leave the modern reader somewhat confounded. These include references to Hebraic, medieval, and Renaissance cultures. It's also much easier to understand the poem if one is familiar with the King James Version of the Bible, or at least the first 3 chapters of Genesis. The style of the poem is also intimidating to some, very formal, and filled with rhetorical speeches, invocations, complex similes, and long lists of names, places, and armies. Fortunately, you don't have to be a scholar to enjoy the essence of this rich and important work. In this session, we'll help you unravel the story and message of Paradise Lost in a way that is simple, clear, and entertaining. Milton considered Paradise Lost the greatest poem ever written. He said it represented, in his words, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. This may not be a very humble point of view, but it's a view that gets lots of support from critics and readers. Few poems take on such an enormous theme as Paradise Lost, a theme that's nothing less than the origin of evil itself. Milton believed evil is embedded in man's nature as a result of the original sin in the Garden of Eden and the sins of the descendants of Adam and Eve, who are our common ancestors. The entire 12 books of the poem recount what takes up only a few verses in Genesis. It's an imaginative and original retelling that mesmerizes the reader. Milton's portrait of Satan is particularly intriguing and even sympathetic. The character is complex and at times unsure, and his inner struggles are very familiar. Adam and Eve are also given more depth, and they're allowed to grow, learn, and become transformed by their experiences in a way that makes them far more real and human. The definition of an epic poem is simply a narrative poem of considerable length, which tells a story of great importance. Its subject should be grand, and its theme should have meaning to all men in all times. Epics never deal with small, trivial subjects or issues. The style of an epic is also elaborate and should make the reader feel awe. It should match in grandeur its subject. There is no doubt that Paradise Lost fulfills these requirements in subject matter and in style. Milton states his subject at the very beginning of the poem as man's first disobedience and the resulting loss of paradise. But the epic doesn't restrict itself just to man's fall. It's also about redemption. It covers the rebellion of the angels, the war in heaven, the creation, the fall, and the history of man to the birth, death and resurrection of Christ, the culminating point for all that has preceded it. The author said his purpose in writing it was to justify the workings of God or providence. Milton refers in his poem to Urania, a muse whom he says has visited him nightly to give him inspiration ever since he decided to write his epic, not about wars and the battles of knights, but about the fall of Adam. He says that with her help he will complete his task, since the glory of the theme can provide any genius he may lack, as would not have been the case if he'd chosen to write about the comparatively trivial matters other epics are devoted to. The man who took on this enormous and ambitious theme and created a classic in the process is a man who led a surprisingly conventional and unspectacular life. John Milton was born in 1608 into a Puritan family in England. His father was a scrivener, someone who records property deeds and titles, and his family was very cultured. Mr. Milton was a talented musician and composer who had some fame among his contemporaries. Perhaps because he was an artist himself, he recognized his son's exceptional gifts and provided him with an excellent education and lots of moral and financial support. John attended one of the best schools in London and also received private tutoring at home. He learned Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian. When his secondary education was completed, he entered Cambridge University, where he was one of the most distinguished students, in spite of a brief suspension for an argument with a teacher. The year he graduated from Cambridge was the same year he wrote his first famous poem, a Christmas ode entitled On the Morning of Christ's Nativity. He also wrote two companion poems called The Cheerful Man and The Pensive Man, which contrast innocent pleasure-seeking with serious, thoughtful pursuits. After he earned an M.A., Milton went to live at his family's country retreat, where for 6 years he pursued reading and writing to prepare himself to be a great poet. As the devout son of very religious parents, he believed that one was called to one's vocation, and very early on he felt his calling was poetry, even though he'd originally trained for the church. After his 6 years of study, Milton left on the grand tour, traveling mainly in France and Italy. He cut his tour short when rumors of a war in England cropped up, and he arrived back in 1639 at the beginning of the Puritan Revolution. During all these years, Milton had been supported by his father, but now both felt it was time he earned his own living. He established himself in London as a schoolmaster and soon became involved in the fiery religious debates of the day. He supported the Puritan party, which wished to reform the Church of England, and he wrote several pamphlets advocating the party's position. During the 1630s, there was a power struggle between King Charles and his Parliament. The king lost some of his power, and Parliament began to reform the Church along the lines of the Puritan party. It was this year that Milton, a staunch Puritan, married Mary Powell. Oddly enough, Mary was a member of a royalist family who supported the king. She was younger than Milton and was accustomed to a large, cheerful household, which she apparently missed. She left him after a very short time to visit her family and didn't return for 3 years. This delay in returning may have been due to the Civil War that broke out in 1642 and made travel to London difficult. Around this time, Milton published his first volume of poems, which includes 2 of his greatest works, Comus and Lycidas. He then turned his attention to the political matters of the day, writing pamphlets and dedicating himself to helping maintain the Puritan Commonwealth. In the political and church disputes that consumed this decade, Milton pled for civil and religious liberty. In 1649, Charles I was beheaded. It was the year Milton was serving as Latin secretary to the Council of State of the Commonwealth, a council headed by Cromwell. In those days, Latin was the official language of diplomacy, and Milton's job was to write whatever letters were sent to other governments. He continued in this role until Cromwell abdicated in 1659. During these years, he and his wife Mary had 3 daughters and 1 son who died in infancy. Mary herself died in childbirth, and it was also near this time that Milton went blind. The disability had come on him gradually, and he'd never let it interfere with his reading and writing. This blindness inspired one of his most moving sonnets, When I Consider, written in 1655. In that poem, he expresses his fear that he'll never be able to use his God-given talents again, and yet his acceptance into heaven may depend on just how well he did use the gifts God gave him. At the end of the poem, Milton accepts that what God wants of him is only obedience, and that even if he can't write poetry, he can serve God. For in his words, "They also serve who only stand and wait." Milton remarried 4 years after Mary's death to the true love of his life, Catherine Woodcock. She too died in childbirth only 15 months later, and the child lived only 1 month. On the occasion of her death, Milton wrote one of his most beautiful sonnets, entitled On His Deceased Wife. In 1660, Charles II took the throne, and Milton's previous politics put him in real danger. The Stuarts and their followers stood for the institutions Milton had fought against most of his life. For a short time he was imprisoned, and when he emerged, he was disillusioned and embittered. In restoring the Stuarts to the throne, he felt his people had turned their back on a republic and on freedom. He lived the rest of his life feeling like an exile. Milton married for the third and last time in 1663 to Elizabeth Minshall. This was chiefly a marriage of convenience. He'd been blind for 11 years and needed someone to run the household and look after his 3 daughters. In spite of his bitterness and disenchantment, this period was a productive one for Milton. It was during these years, when he felt he'd become the prophet no one listened to, that he completed his greatest works, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. Milton had planned to write an epic his entire life, since it was considered the greatest and highest poetic form. Originally, he'd planned to use King Arthur as his subject, so he could glorify England just as Virgil had glorified Rome. But he changed his mind and chose a topic of far wider significance, which glorified not a nation, but God and creation itself. No one knows exactly when Milton began his masterpiece, but he planned it as early as 1640, and his comments in the poem make it clear that it was written after he'd become blind. He composed the poem in segments in his mind, memorized them, and then dictated them to a secretary. The poem was finished in 1665 and published 2 years later. Milton received an initial payment of £5 for Paradise Lost, and an additional payment of £5 on the sale of the first 3 editions. His widow later settled all claims on the publication for £8. In total, £18 were paid for a work that took nearly a decade to write and became a classic in English literature. We'll take you through the story of Paradise Lost in a moment, but first let's review the central characters with whom you're already well acquainted. They include Satan, who is earlier called Lucifer. Satan is a fallen angel, once one of God's favorites, who rebels and becomes committed to spreading evil on earth. Other important characters are Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, created in God's image. Eve and Adam both consider that he is the superior of the two, but they each have their flaws. Eve's is vanity and a susceptibility to flattery. Adam's is a passion for Eve that overrides his loyalty to God and his rational judgment. Other major characters are, of course, God, and also God the Son, and various angels and demons. John Milton begins his epic by stating its subject, in his words, "Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us, and regain the blissful seat." As is traditional in most classic epics, he then invokes his muse to inspire him in his adventurous song, but appeals with even greater fervor to the spirit that it may instruct him in how to illuminate what is dark and raise what is low, so that he, the author, may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. The story begins. Satan, the once radiant Lucifer and the highest angel in heaven, lays in a formless, sulphurous lake of fire, surrounded by his band of angels. They have just been hurled out of heaven and have plummeted down through space into the bottomless pit of hell. Now, after 9 days unconscious, Satan and his demons awake and recover from their confusion. Satan resolves that his salvation shall be his strength. To be weak, he says, is to be miserable, and obedience to the will of God is weakness. This weakness must be repudiated. Evil will be his good, and to do evil rather than good shall be the sole task of him and his followers. He rejoices in his new freedom of mind, for the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. But Satan and his demons have been used to living in the glory of heaven, and they find their new home horrifying. They hold a meeting to decide how they might escape hell and recover at least some of their former glory. They are too proud to seek readmittance to heaven through repentance, so everyone agrees with Satan that it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. One demon suggests they try to transform hell into a kingdom as beautiful as heaven, but Beelzebub, Satan's right-hand man, proposes something else. He had heard God is planning to create a new world to serve as home to some new race called man, to be created like to us, though less in power and excellence. If they act quickly, he says, they could gain control of this new world and make this new race of men their slaves. All present approve this vengeful plot, and Satan himself offers to make the perilous journey through the gates of hell, across space, and into the new earth. After a lengthy trek, he runs across a heavenly angel named Uriel, who is custodian of the orb of the sun. He gets Uriel to point out the new earth by disguising himself as a lovely little cherub. He feigns an innocent interest in creation and an unspeakable desire to behold its wondrous works, especially man. Uriel says, "But what created mind can grasp God's infinite wisdom and power? I saw his word bring order and light to chaos and create the world you see. Look down upon the globe below, which shines with light reflected from this sun. It is the earth, the seat of man. I am pointing directly to paradise, Adam's home. You cannot miss your way, nor may I neglect mine." Satan bows to him and takes flight towards earth. His travels to earth, however, are not unnoticed by God. God explains to his Son that Satan will eventually succeed in the fall of man, bringing upon him death and punishment. But he says he has created man as a free being, capable of resisting temptation. If man and the angels had not been created free, there would have been no merit in their praise of God and their obedience to him. They would have served not him, God says, but necessity. But he sees that man will sin, and because he will, he must suffer death. Unless someone will die for man, someone whose nature is such that he will be able to make full recompense for man's offense. Who then will take this burden upon himself? All present are silent. Then the compassionate Son offers to give his life in order to save men. "Man will find grace," says the Son, "because I shall take man's nature, permitting death to wreak his full vengeance on me. Then I shall rise again, despoiling death of his victim. Thus I shall kill death." The rest of the heavenly host gaze in admiration at the Son, and the Father accepts this sacrifice and commands his angels to adore the Son. In the meantime, they will leave Satan to his wiles. Satan finds paradise is in the eastern part of Eden, at the top of a mountainside whose rough sides make it almost unapproachable. The garden is surrounded by walls of living green, from which Adam and Eve can view the lower regions of the world. The atmosphere is fragrant, the air is pure, the trees and fruits abundant. Choirs of birds sing, streams run over golden sands, there are cool grottos and gentle waterfalls. Satan is overwhelmed by earth's beauty. But instead of filling him with joy, that beauty fills him with jealousy and spite, for it evokes memories of the paradise he has lost. In an intense speech full of self-doubt, fear, and bitterness, Satan laments his fall and prophesies a future of even worse torments. He concludes that he'll never be able to escape hell, since hell is within him. "Which way I fly is hell, myself am hell." But if he himself could not have peace and paradise, then he would divide God's kingdom and possibly rule over the greater part of God's creation. Satan searches paradise and discovers Adam and Eve. He disguises himself as various beasts, so he may observe the first man and woman, and he marvels at their beauty and nobility, and at the love they share. Adam's greater height and nobler brow proclaim him to be the higher of the two. Eve is gentle, with hair that falls in curls to her waist and wraps around her like vines. They walk hand in hand in innocence and freedom, he the handsomest of men, and she the most beautiful of women who have ever lived. They work lightly in the day and take their rest at night, as God commanded them to do. As Satan watches, Eve and Adam sit down beside a fountain to eat their supper. All the beasts of the earth gather to entertain them, including the lion, the bear, the elephant. Satan watches the scene in wonder, but it only fires his jealousy more. Later he observes them at their tasks in Eden, tending the gardens and gathering the food, and he eavesdrops on their affectionate conversations. In one conversation he learns they are forbidden to eat of the tree of knowledge. He's astonished to see they have full faculties of speech and reasoning, and yet they're so innocent they enjoy sexual union without the least bit of lust. After performing their evening devotions, Adam and Eve retire to their bed in a bower covered with laurel and myrtle. Only they are allowed in this bower. The animals never venture towards the shelter of the two who are the highest forms of life on earth. As Eve sleeps, Satan crouches as a toad beside her and whispers lies into her ear. But a guardian angel arrives and puts an end to his mischief. He's interrogated by the angel and claims that hell is such a dreary place, he just wanted to take a look at something beautiful. Just because he was near Adam and Eve, he says, doesn't mean he was going to do them any harm. The angel isn't fooled, but releases him just the same. The next morning, Eve awakens, thinking she's had a terrible nightmare, in which an angel tempted her to eat the fruit of the forbidden tree of knowledge. She cries, and Adam soothes her, saying that what she abhorred in a dream, she will certainly not do in her waking hours. She dries 2 tears, and Adam kisses 2 others away. Then he takes her by the hand into the garden, where they can begin their daily work. God sees that his creation is in danger, and sends his messenger angel, Raphael, to warn Adam and Eve to be on the lookout for the devious Satan. Adam sees the beautiful light that marks Raphael's arrival, and he tells Eve to prepare for a divine guest. They strew flowers in Raphael's path and prepare a sumptuous feast of fruit for him. They're not sure that angels eat earthly food, but Raphael explains to them that he can eat this food and transform it into his own lighter substance. In listening to Raphael's warning, Adam finds himself curious about Satan's past. At this point, Eve leaves, not because she won't be able to understand what will be said, but because she would rather hear it from Adam, whom she loves. The angel gives Adam an account of Satan's fall. The whole problem started when God assembled the angels and told them he'd anointed his son, who stood at his right side, as a lord over them all. Lucifer was full of envy and managed to organize a group of other malcontents to contest God's power. 1/3 of God's angels joined Satan. The battle that followed lasted 3 days. On the first day, the loyal angels bested Satan's army. Satan retreated, but during the night he invented diabolical machines with which he surprised the angels on the second day. The angels finally overcame their foes by picking up hills with all their loads of rocks, water, and woods, and hurling them at them. But even such a blast from the celestial forces was insufficient, and the demons returned. On the 3rd day, God sent his Son to personally lead his forces. The Son of God, with his multitudinous legions beside him, and fierce chariots at his command, and 10,000 thunders in his right hand, drove like a flood through Satan and his followers, and forced them over the edge of heaven and into the waiting flames. They fell into the bottomless pit with an insufferable noise. Raphael then describes the creation of the earth and of man and woman, the 6 days of work that ushered in the Sabbath. Raphael tells him men were created in God's own image to dwell on earth, where they were to worship their Creator and receive as their reward regency over all God's works, and happiness and posterity for themselves. Now Adam asks further questions. In particular, he's curious about the heavenly bodies he can see from earth. Is it the earth that moves, or the sky? Raphael tells him none of this is as important as his admiration for the wondrous works of God. But he does say that the luminaries in the sky exist, not for the earth, but for man. They help remind him of how small he is compared to the universe and to God, thus guaranteeing his humility. Then he advises Adam not to seek knowledge he cannot understand, to be lowly wise and grateful for the knowledge of heaven he has already attained. At that point, Adam tells his own story, of the memories of his beginning. He recounts how filled with awe and gratitude he was to find himself a man, and how he didn't even know by what name to call he who had created him. but he became lonely with no one to share the bounties of paradise with. God brought him many creatures, and he knew instinctively what to name each. But none of them was his equal, so he begged God for a partner in kind. He tells of how, as he slept, he saw a vision of God fashioning a woman from his rib. She was so beautiful that all the things he thought beautiful before now seemed hardly fair. He adds that wisdom and reason wait upon her as though she had been created first and made only to be served. Then Adam wants to know whether heavenly bodies like Raphael love one another, and if so, how they express that love. Raphael smiles and tells Adam it will suffice him to know that the angels are happy with the happiness which cannot come without love. With one final warning to beware of Satan and the many forms he can take, Raphael returns to heaven. Satan, meanwhile, has returned in darkest midnight, assuming the disguise of a mist as it rises from the earth. He is looking for an opportunity to influence Adam or Eve, and particularly Eve, whom he considers more vulnerable. One day, Eve insists on working alone, although she and Adam have always worked together, enjoying each other's company and conversation. She feels they can get twice as much work done if they split up, and although Adam is fearful of leaving her unguarded, he can't convince her to stay. Eve feels they can't be happy if they live in constant fear, and that Eden is not Eden if it is so frail as to expose them to harm. Furthermore, she's offended by the idea that she can't protect herself. She goes off to work in the garden and promises to be back by noon for lunch. But this Eve will never return. Satan takes the guise of a snake because he has heard the snake is the most intelligent of the earth's animals. What foul descent was this that he who had contended with the gods must now incarnate himself in such a creature and mix with bestial slime? Satan finds the serpent sleeping, enters its mouth, and endows its brute sense with intelligence. He approaches Eve, who is in the garden tending to her roses, walking upright, since the snake has not yet been doomed to crawl. He flatters her, telling her she is beautiful and he loves her, and that she has the potential to be a goddess. Beauty such as hers should be admired in heaven, not on earth. Eve wonders at his effusiveness, but is none the less pleased. She asks him how he knows how to talk, and he replies that he ate a certain fruit. As soon as he tasted it, he knew speech and reason, and if she'd like, he will show her the tree from which he picked this fruit. Eve follows him to the tree and sees it's the forbidden tree of knowledge. She protests that she can't eat the fruit, but Satan then engages her in a clever and subtle argument. He says that if the fruit could give a mere serpent human qualities, think what it could do for her. She would be a goddess, as she deserves. Furthermore, the warning that the fruit means certain death is bogus, since he himself has eaten the fruit and has not died. Persuaded by his words, Eve begins to eat the fruit, and the earth groans because all is lost. She finds her appetite for it is almost insatiable. She gorges herself into drunkenness, and then mistakes that drunkenness for a state of higher knowing. She bows in reverence before the tree, as if it is a god, and goes to join Adam in their bower, where he waits with a garland of flowers for her. Eve tells him what she's done. Adam is speechless, horrified at her deed, but his devotion to her is so great that he decides he would rather share her fate, whatever it is, than to be separated from her, and if she is to die, then he would rather die with her. So he too agrees to eat the fruit. Eve leads him to the tree, and he eats, knowing he is doing wrong, but unable to bear the thought of losing Eve. The earth groans again, even more deeply than it did when Eve ate of the fruit. Now they are both drunk, and with the intoxication comes lust. Their sexual union lacks all the innocence that used to bless it, and they awake the next morning feeling unrested, suffering from a hangover, and overcome with shame. They immediately begin to fashion clothes from fig leaves that will cover the parts of their bodies that remind them of their licentiousness. And they weep. Afterwards they argue. Each blames the other for what they've done. Adam tells Eve she should have stayed with him as he requested. Eve tells Adam he should have been more forceful in making her stay. Anger, discord, and distrust have replaced their love. But later Eve approaches Adam with tenderness and regret, and they are reconciled. They decide to beg God for forgiveness, and the son, hearing their pleas, carries the message to his father. God sends his son to judge them, and the son arrives in the garden just as night is falling. God calls out for them, and Adam and Eve approach, embarrassed. God asks Adam what he has done, and Adam explains that Eve tempted him to eat the fruit, and he must accuse her because he can't bear to take all the blame himself. He says that God made Eve, and he, Adam, trusted her and was seduced by her. When God asks Eve what she has done, she replies simply, "The serpent beguiled me, and I ate it." The son then curses the serpent, condemning it to grovel on its belly rather than walk upright. He adds that he will make the serpent and woman enemies, and that her seed will bruise its head, and the serpent shall bruise its heel. God says he will forgive them, but they must leave the garden, and they must lose their immortality. To the woman and all who follow her, there will be great pain in bearing children. To the men, the world will now require toil and sweat. There will be the curse of thorns, weeds, and briars. God sends one of his chief angels, Michael, to escort Adam and Eve from the garden. Satan, meanwhile, has flown back to hell to proclaim his victory. On the way, he met Sin and Death, who were busy building a road to earth, and he bargained with them to become their ambassadors on earth. In hell, Satan is proudly telling the tale of his seduction of Adam and Eve, but instead of the roaring applause he expects, he hears only hisses. Every one of the demons has been turned into a serpent. Trees pop up, exact replicas of the tree of knowledge, but when the mass of serpents struggles to bite the fruit, it turns into bitter ashes. The Son prevents the demons of hell from becoming mortal and experiencing death. He wants them to forever be the hated enemy of mankind. On earth, Adam and Eve notice the changes occurring around them. The nights are dark and cold, not gentle as they used to be. Instead of an eternal spring, the seasons change, and with these changes come storms, floods, and winds. The animals that used to live in peace now prey upon each other, and animals that were once Adam and Eve's companions, such as the birds, now fly from their presence. Adam bewails his fate, and can't see how he will obey God's command to multiply, since all his progeny will be cursed. Eve endeavors to console him, but he responds with a tirade against womanhood, wondering why God had not been satisfied with purely masculine spirits, angels and men, rather than creating this fair defect of nature. Eve admits her frailty and suggests that to save their progeny from sin and death, they become celibate. Both even contemplate suicide. But Adam reminds Eve that God promised that her seed would bruise the serpent's head, and finally they decide to seek pardon and peace from God. They both fall prostrate and yield themselves to tearful penitence and supplication. Now Michael arrives and fills their hearts with hope. God will forgive their sin, but they are to be expelled from the garden. At first this fills them with grief, for the garden has been the source of their delight and comfort. But soon they accept their fate with resignation. Then Michael shows them a vision of the future of mankind, their children and descendants, Cain and Abel, wars and the rise and fall of kingdoms, the discovery of music and metal, Noah, Abraham, Moses, the coming of the Messiah and his death, resurrection, and expiration to redeem fallen man, the progress of God's church, and in the end, the Lord's second coming. When he is finished, Adam doesn't know whether to repent of his sins or take joy in that God will bring so much good out of the evil he has done. Adam thanks Michael for what he has shown him and says that he will not seek again to know what he has no right to know. He knows now that love, obedience, and trust in God are most important, and that suffering for the truth is the highest form of bravery. He knows also that death is actually the gateway to life. Michael says that Adam has achieved the highest wisdom. Eve, who has seen it all in a dream while she sleeps, is also comforted. Now she is ready to go. She says that as long as she is with Adam, she's in paradise, no matter what place they're in. And she knows, too, that her promised seed will restore all that her sin has lost. Feeling more hopeful now about the ultimate redemption of their race, Adam and Eve take the path that leads from their garden of paradise down to the lonely, barren world at the bottom of the mountain. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. At the end of Paradise Lost, paradise has been lost, and there is the promise that it will be refound. And in that promise, Milton has fulfilled the obligation he defined for himself at the beginning of the poem, to justify the ways of God to men. The word justify could have meant that Milton only intended to prove that God is fair, that his decision to oust Adam and Eve from paradise and punish their offspring was just. But this wouldn't be enough to resolve the problems with Satan, since Satan has declared he's going to turn all of God's good into evil. If Adam and Eve are merely punished, Satan will still win. So God must do more. He must bring good out of evil, and thus completely defeat and confound Satan. Justify, in this poem, means more than to explain the fairness of God. It is to explain how all his decisions are designed to defeat evil and enable good to triumph. In the last section of the book, where the angel Michael describes to Adam the events of the upcoming future, we see how each and all together work towards transforming evil into good. In fact, it's this that leads Adam to comment that he doesn't know whether to regret his evil or feel gratitude for it. If evil can be utilized for the spiritual learning and redemption of man, then Satan has no hope whatsoever, because evil ceases to be evil. This justification of Milton's is also clearly stated in the passages in which God speaks about free will. He says he's not responsible for the fall of the angels or of men. He has given them all the gift of free will. He has told them what they must do and has given them what they need to do it. It is a dangerous situation because, of course, those who are free to make the wrong choices. God also says that foreknowledge of man's sin doesn't make him responsible for that sin. His knowledge is not the cause of it. This fact justifies God on one level, but God cannot be passive. He must do more for man, or Satan has won. Therefore God shows mercy for man when he sinned, and he also sends them his Son to accept their punishment for them. Man's redemption is the most obvious and strongest justification Milton offers, but he also includes a section of the poem that refers to his own physical blindness, and which includes justification on a more personal, individual level. In this section, Milton asks for God's aid in helping him to turn his blindness to good. He can't see the physical world, therefore, with God's grace, perhaps he can see the celestial light. Milton prays to be granted sight even better than the physical sight he once had, spiritual sight that reveals the ultimate truths. So the poem's theme, simply put, that good can come out of evil, is expressed outside the events of Genesis as well. This offers the reader an example of how the divine theme of justification of God can be applied to mundane life, of how we can integrate that learning and realization with our own experiences. This theory of good out of evil is in accordance with the Christian doctrine of the happy fall, which Milton clearly subscribes to. His attitude after the fall of Adam and Eve is hopeful and even celebratory at times. That happiness comes from the fact that if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, Christ would never have been born. Not only that, but the fall gave man the opportunity to better himself. Innocence is a virtue, but the humility and shame that comes with sinning opens the way to far greater virtues: tolerance, compassion, and understanding. These virtues are almost impossible for innocence to attain, because an innocent has no way of understanding suffering or people's weaknesses. By the end of the poem, Adam and Eve have left their innocence behind, but they have gained these greater virtues. In addition, they've become wiser. They know that peace and happiness depend on their inner selves, not their environment. They also know that there are many things they can't comprehend, and that their time is better spent in obedience and devotion than in trying to unravel the mysteries of God and His universe. This is why their fall is ultimately a happy fall. Their own consciousness has been broadened, and the life of Christ will make possible an even higher life for man than Adam and Eve's innocence could ever have achieved. This is the inspiring message that emerges from the beautifully elaborate language and the arresting story of Paradise Lost. It is perhaps not a new message, and it is certainly not a new story, but it's a message and a story freshly presented and eloquently conveyed.
This is the end of the session.